Hello, everyone. My name is Grace Caternolo, and I am the Library Marketing Assistant at HarperCollins Publishers. I'm honored to be joined by Aran Robert Shetterly and Margot Lee Shetterly. They will be in conversation about Aran's forthcoming book, Morningside, the 1979 Greensboro Massacre and the Struggle for an American City's Soul. It is on sale October 15th, 2024 from Amistad, an imprint of HarperCollins. Before I pass it off, here's a bit about Aran and Margot. Aran Shetterly is a writer, editor, and narrative historian. He is the author of the critically acclaimed The Americano, Fighting with Castro for Cuba's Freedom, the founder of the Mexico City-based magazine Inside Mexico, and a member of the board of Americans Who Tell the Truth organization. He has received numerous fellowships, including the Virginia Humanities Fellowship and the 2019 National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. Aran holds a BA in literature from Harvard College and an MA in American Studies. He currently lives in Charlottesville, Virginia, with his son and wife. Writer, researcher, and entrepreneur Margot Lee Shetterly is the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, Hidden Figures, The American Dream, and the Untold Story of the Black Women Mathematicians Who Helped Win the Space Race, and an executive producer of the Oscar-nominated film adaptation of her book. She is also a founder of the Human Computer Project, a digital archive telling stories of all of NASA's quote-unquote human computers. Shetterly is a scholar in residence at the University of Virginia with joint appointments at the McIntire School of Commerce and the School of Engineering. Thank you both for being here today. I'm so thrilled that we're going to hear more about Morningside. And without further ado, take it away.
Thank you, Grace.
Aran Shetterly. There is a rumor around the office here that you have a book that is about to come out. Morningside, show this to the camera here.
You've heard that rumor?
I've heard the rumor around the office that consists basically of the two of us. So what I was hoping that we could do to start out is if you could tell us a little bit about Morningside. What is this book all about?
Thanks, Margot. Yeah, at the center of Morningside is a shocking event. On November 3rd, 1979, a group of labor organizers and racial justice activists were organizing a march against the Ku Klux Klan, which had been interfering with their work in Greensboro, North Carolina, and the surrounding area, the Piedmont of North Carolina. And as they were setting up, a caravan of Klansmen and neo-Nazis drove up, started a fight, and started shooting, leaving 5 dead and 9 of them injured. It was a shocking case of political and racially motivated violence. It was all captured on film. Now, this is something we're somewhat used to with the ubiquity of cell phones today, but at that time, it was fairly unusual to have a crime like this captured on film. There were 4 news crews, they were filming. So there was this huge amount of evidence that zipped around the country that night and was on the nightly news. And people saw this happen. And yet, despite the film, despite all the witnesses, no one was ever held criminally accountable for the shooting that day. And so Morningside is about that event and how it came to pass. It's about the mystery of why local and federal law enforcement didn't prevent the event, but it's also about the courage and fortitude it takes often in this country, too often, I would say, in this country, to fight for our ideals of equality for all and equal justice. And at the heart of the book are Nelson Johnson, who organized that march and survived it, though he was stabbed, and his wife, Joyce Johnson, who since the 1960s to the present, they're still doing it in Greensboro, are trying to work for Black people, Hispanic people, poor people of all colors, and anyone who hasn't had a fair shake in our society, and to make us live up to the ideals that we say we stand for.
So tell me a little bit about how this story came to you, and what was it that moved you to write about it?
Well, you were there in 2015 when you and my father, who's a painter and had a show of paintings for his Americans Who Tell the Truth organization in Greensboro, were introduced to Nelson and Joyce Johnson at a little cafe in downtown Greensboro. And they came in and we sat together for about 2 hours. And they told us about their story, this history. And I remember sitting there being absolutely stunned that I'd never heard of it before. And it's a reaction we'll talk about more, but that other people seem to always have when they hear about this history. The other thing that happened, though, is Nelson recounted a time 8 years after the shooting when the Klan, we're talking 1987, when the Klan was going to march again in Greensboro. And he decided that this was not acceptable for the Klan to march in Greensboro 8 years after the shooting, and took it upon himself as a gesture of, in a sense, goodwill to the city, but also the beginning of a journey of redemption for himself, because he felt horrible and guilty about the deaths of his friends and comrades that he had worked with back in 1979, and drove out all alone into rural North Carolina to meet with the Klan and ask them not to come. And it was this remarkably courageous, some might say even foolhardy act. But he had that conversation. It was an interesting conversation that ranged from enlightening to vulgar, and between a Black man and two people whose friends had killed his friends. And he came back with the agreement from the Klan that they wouldn't start any trouble when they came to Greensboro, and they didn't. But I walked out of that conversation in 2015 with the hair standing up on the back of my neck and wanting to know more about Nelson and Joyce Johnson, but also this story seemed to connect to so many persistent issues that we are always grappling with in this country, whether it's equality, whether it's police brutality and the relationship of police to community, whether it's about how the justice system works, and about how communities get divided around complicated history. And I thought, wow, this is a really fascinating way in to explore a bunch of questions that have always interested me, and try to understand them more deeply and better.
Now, I would characterize this as something of a lost history. I grew up in Virginia, right next door to the Greensboro massacre. I never heard about this history. Why do you think that is?
It's interesting. A number of people I've shared this story with, we say, Morningside, the 1979 Greensboro massacre and the struggle for an American city's soul. They say, wait a minute, you mean 1879? Mm-hmm. And so I think one answer is that we imagine some of these issues that persist today to have been relegated to our past. We hope they've been relegated to our past. We want to believe they've been relegated to our past, and too often they actually haven't. They persist, and they don't always. They aren't always equally present. Sometimes they go away for a little while and then they pop up. But we know that this history continues to matter and continues to inform how we interpret our present. But the first thing I'd say, there's a couple more practical answers to that question. One is that the very day after the November 3rd shooting in 1979, the hostages were taken in the American embassy in Tehran, in Iran. And this became the story. Nightline with Ted Koppel was founded to report on the hostage situation. And it dominated the next year of news every night, and played an important role in the election between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. And on Ronald Reagan's inauguration day, those hostages were released. So it was a lot easier for us to talk about us versus them, the United States versus Iran, than it was to talk about these complex issues that connect to our history of us versus us. So I think that was very important. Another reason, however, though, is that the political and business leaders in Greensboro and North Carolina and even beyond wanted to explain this event as an accident of history, the shooting, between the activists and the Klansmen and Nazis, and the murders, as an accident between extremist groups who did not represent their place. That, in a sense, there was no meaning. It was an erratic act of violence, and there was no relationship between the place and this moment, between the history of the place and what happened there. When I read that, as I began to look into this, it was one of the real motivating factors for me. It's like, of course, there's a relationship between the history of this place and what just happened there. And I want to figure out what that history is.
So really, taking a little bit of a from that answer and your explanation there, what you've done here in this book is you have taken all of these people, and you've told it from multiple points of view. You know, we have the activists at the heart of the story. We have the Klansmen who shot them. We have the Greensboro police, the FBI agents who investigated this crime. And there is so much detail in this book. So much of it is personal. So for example, excuse me, the episode when Joyce Johnson, this is very close to the beginning of the book, you know, the inciting incident, right? Joyce Johnson's best friend has been shot and killed. Her husband has been stabbed and then taken away with the police. And she still has to figure out some way to have someone care for their two young daughters. You know, this is a mother's moment. All of these things that she is in this one confusing, a horrible moment, defining moment in her life. And you even bring that detail of understanding what was really going on. You know, you drop us into the city council elections that are happening right before, you know, the shooting takes place. Can you talk to us a little bit about your research process? There were so many different kinds of sources. What did it take for you to bring this very complex narrative to life?
So first I'd say, and you know this, Margot, when you're writing narrative nonfiction, what you're trying to do is to not explain a moment so much as bring it to life. And bring it to life means people and their stories and their emotions and how they make choices. And so the research, which I love research. I love going into archives. I love libraries. I mean, it's one of my favorite, happiest places is to be immersed in an archive going through documents. You always find something interesting and something surprising and something you didn't know about. But I had to know the facts of this history as I could. And there are always mysteries that you can't quite solve in a project like this. But I had to know as many of the facts or all the facts as they were knowable. But I also interviewed scores of people multiple times and asking them about specific moments in this history and what they did and how they decided to do that and what they felt. Because that's what's going to bring this story to life. And it's what, in a sense, the challenge is for a book like this to make it not only meaningful, but easily readable to a broad audience who can enter it and identify with the different people and different characters in it. But I'll add one more piece. There are, you know, write about Klansmen, FBI officers, policemen, judges, lawyers, activists. And I try to focus on the humanity of each and every one. I don't want one-dimensional characters, people who are only good or only bad. That's not very interesting or true to me. And so I try to draw out the humanity of each of them. And I have to give Nelson and Joyce Johnson some credit for helping me do that, because their philosophy of beloved community, which they took from Martin Luther King Jr., means believing in the possible transformation and growth of every single human being. And I tried to bring that sensibility to this work and to be very open to the different points of view, at least representing them, even if I disagreed with them. And so I, in a lot of cases, will present to the reader how someone thinks in this book and he or she can decide, how they orient themselves with respect to that point of view.
I think that's a very powerful thing that you're doing here. And this book, you're telling us about an episode in American history that is contested. You're telling us about an episode in American history that is contentious. And this book is coming out at a time when political polarization is alarmingly high. And when it seems everything that we talk about in the public sphere is also contested, is also contentious. How do you think that Morningside can help us to understand the current moment that we're in, and maybe take some lessons for getting past it, making it through it?
So that's a great question, Margot. We live in a moment when we can't even agree on the facts in a lot of cases, let alone the meaning of the facts, but the facts themselves. And one of the things I think this book does is it gives a window into when the facts are contested and they can't be agreed on in a community, right? Let alone expand that to the whole country, how divisive that is. So, for example, there are a number of myths that circulate in Greensboro about what happened the day of November 3rd or leading up to November 3rd. So, for example, one is people like to say, well, no one knows who fired the first shot, as though it could have been the activists or it could have been the Klansmen and neo-Nazis. Well, that's just not true. We know exactly who fired the first shot, the second shot, the third shot, every shot. That's knowable and it's known.
And why is that knowable and known?
Well, one question is why it isn't generally known. And why it isn't generally known is because the defense lawyers for the Klan and Nazis very skillfully cast doubt on who had fired which shots. However, when you read through the depositions in the case and you line up the sort of where the sounds were and who was holding guns and you analyze the video, you can identify each shot with a person. So that's one myth that's used in Greensboro to essentially cast doubt on the veracity of the activist narrative about what happened that day. Another myth is that the police were confused about where the start of the march was and that they'd been misled by the activists to think that it was in a place different from where it actually was. Well, this isn't the case either. We can go through the police transcripts of their meeting leading up to the march and know that they knew exactly where the march was going to start. So these are the kinds of sort of distortions that get introduced into a narrative that lead to confusion, that lead to doubt, and lead to division, it seems to me. And one of the things that this book carries through this history, through the trials and through Nelson and Joyce Johnson's reinvention of themselves from communists to people who followed Christianity and sort of liberation theology, and the idea of a radical Jesus and radical love being the basis of what change could be, up to something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was the first of its kind in the United States, modeled on what South Africa did after the collapse and fall of apartheid, and Nelson Mandela coming in as president of that country. And the idea of that was to understand the truth of the history so that it could be resolved and reconciled and people could move beyond it. But important to that was the idea that you can't get to reconciliation until you know the truth, and that the truth has to come first. And I hope that, that process was incredibly important, in the documents that came out of that truth and reconciliation process in Greensboro were critical to my research. And they're housed in another library at Bennett College in Greensboro that I got to spend some time going through those archives. But that process gave me the clues to follow to get the information I needed to create this narrative. And it left a blueprint for how Greensboro looked at it, establishing the truth around a complicated event in their community. And it's been picked up and gone from coast to coast, from Maine to California. They've come to Greensboro to understand how they did it, to try to replicate that process and create a sense of shared facts in their community. It doesn't mean everyone's going to agree about what those facts mean, but at least they can begin from a basis of to have a conversation from a shared understanding of what actually transpired.
So you have given us a very unsparing history. You have taken a hard look at everything that happened in this very challenging history. But you have also, with your book, left room for hope. Can you tell us a little bit about why you chose the title Morningside? What does Morningside mean to this story?
Great question. And honestly, I not only did I see hope through this story, but it was very important for me to communicate hope through this story. We need hope, and we need people who offer us hope. And I think that's what this story is in large degree about. So the title Morningside, Morningside is the name of the public housing development where the shooting took place in 1979. Now, to understand that place and that location and why it mattered, I researched the history of that development. And it came about in the 1950s, mid-1950s. It was opened to Black residents of Greensboro with the idea that it would be a stepping stone from the working class to the middle class. And it began with a great deal of hope. By 1979, it was still a segregated housing development. And the tone had changed from people feeling like this was a hopeful step to feeling trapped. That and the stories in the newspaper about Morningside by then were no longer about, you know, meetings of the sorority or the library committee or you know, how to improve the playground for the kids, but all of a sudden the stories were in the crime reports and about drugs and about dysfunction. Even though, and I think this is important to point out, that community still cared for, nurtured its children, and they went off to do interesting things. But the narrative had changed, and the tone had changed about what it was this represented. So fast forward, and in the early 2000s, Morningside is torn down and replaced with a different kind of housing. Offered some sort of a mixed development, if you will, of different income levels where people could buy a house or people could rent. But some people in the city felt that this development had been torn down to erase the history and erase the history of Morningside and what had happened there on November 3rd, 1979. I had a policeman tell me it had been torn down for that reason. I had activists tell me they thought that there was some motivation there to just completely obliterate the geography of where this contested history happened, so we didn't have to think about it anymore. So, but at the same time, in the word Morningside, there's the hint of morning. It's the world keeps turning. The sun comes up. There's hope. We get to start a new day and try again. And this takes me back once again to Nelson and Joyce Johnson. And what they like to say is that the hope is in the struggle, and to focus on the fierce urgency of now. Even though they know change takes a long time, they focus on what can we do right now. And they've never given up. And just that model of them waking up each day and going to fight for Greensboro's poor people gives me a tremendous amount of hope, and inspires me to think about what I can do. And I hope that when people read this book, they'll look at them and say, wow, people really can do this. It carries a great deal of risk. It's very hard, but look at the amazing lives they've actually lived and what they can claim to have done to help their own community. It's remarkable and magnificent.
Now, Aran, I have one more question.
Mhm.
We're talking to, because it's the internet, we're talking to everyone, obviously, but this is really specifically geared for librarians, the guardians of our history and of our creative spirits in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
What is it that you want librarians to know about your book?
Well, we live in a moment where libraries, speaking of contested history, right, have suddenly become contested spaces. And they are trying to, seems so many librarians are trying to protect each of our ability to go in and pursue what it is we're curious about, learn something new, see another side of something, keep our minds open. And I know how hard librarians work to do that job. And I think that what I'd like them to know about my book is, while it offers another side to this history, and one that can be a little bit challenging, it also, I think, will be interesting to lots of different people from lots of different backgrounds, because I think they'll see pieces of themselves reflected in it, and then perhaps give them pause to think about that. So I think it's a book that is, I hope, going to be interested not just for a single demographic or single, ideological perspective, but to people from all different backgrounds who are also feeling the need to understand a little more about why things are so complicated in our country right now. And that if it doesn't give them answers, will give them insights or prompt them to find insights. I hope. We'll see.
Well, I have seen you working on this book over the course of the past 7 years. I am really impressed. I've read it, obviously, more than once. I'm very proud of you, and I am very excited for the rest of the world to see what I've been able to see. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on the book, which will be published on October 15th, 2024. By Amistad, imprint of HarperCollins. So Aran Shetterly, thank you so much.
Thank you, Margot. I couldn't have done it without your help.
Well, it was a pleasure and an honor.
That was a fantastic conversation. I could listen to you talk all day, and I really loved what you said about writing narrative nonfiction. You're not trying to explain it to people, but bring it to life. And I think that's exactly what you did with Morningside. And once again, October 15th, 2024. And thank you both. And thank you to everyone listening.